Thank you for the invitation to speak. It's great to be able to present my work, and especially great for me to be able to present my work to people working in the dynamical systems area, because being at CSIRO, I'm a little bit more embedded in the climate world at the moment. And so it's nice to get some feedback from the dynamics side of things, which is where I came from for my PhD. So yeah, so I've been working in a postdoc at CSIRO for the past few years with Terry O'Kane, and also been doing some studies alongside another postdoc, Dylan Harries, who's now over in South Australia, actually. He's moved away from climate and to the medical field. But we've been trying to tackle this question of this connection between dynamics and data-driven reduced methods, basically, like the methodologies that one uses with these large data sets you get, particularly in climate modeling and in the climate science world. So the work today that I'll be discussing can be found in the two papers that I've listed here. So the first was published earlier this year. Yep, that's the right year. And so that's most of the work on the North Atlantic oscillation. And the second one is in peer review at the moment. But there is the preprint version is available on Earth Archive, and that will be updated with the updated versions as it goes. So I'll start off. Oh, how do I do this there it is, okay. So I'll start off with just like the motivation, which I already said a bit about. So we know that in the climate science community, for instance, there's a push towards using data-driven methods that one can incorporate all of these like noisy, complex climate data that one gets, your atmospheric and oceanic fields. There's a push to use data-driven methods to really pull out coherent behavior, I guess, and regime type behavior in these models, and try to get some kind of understanding from the noise, I guess one could say. And our main question was, okay, well, you have all of these data-driven methods, and you can use them to identify climate teleconnections, which I'll talk a bit about on the next slide. Some of these can provide us with simplified models, but do those simplified models actually show meaningful dynamical behavior? So it's this kind of like this discussion of, okay, are we just throwing computing tools out of it and just fitting all the data to something that looks nice, or are we actually getting some of the dynamics and physics correct as well when we're doing this? The outline of what I'll talk about today is I'll first just introduce climate teleconnections a bit, in case that's a less familiar area for people. And then I'll go into the FEM-BV-VAR methodology, which is a specific data-driven method we use. And then how that feeds into the dynamical model that we then analyze for our teleconnections that we want to look at. And once we've constructed that model, I'm going to then look at characterizing the dynamics of that model using what we've termed mixed singular vectors and covariant Lyapunov vectors. This includes looking at finite time behavior of growth rates and alignment. And then we'll have a quick comparison at the end between singular vectors and mixed singular vectors, and what makes them different and how this connects to numerical weather prediction. So climate teleconnections are basically climate anomalies, or anomalies in atmospheric and oceanic variables that can represent climate or climate states of the climate, I guess, which are relatively persistent and influenced by each other over very large distances, so often thousands of kilometers. El Nino is probably the most popular of those that is being talked about all the time. So you have the ENSO, so the El Nino, La Nina, Southern Oscillation connection there. You also have, that's in the ocean, you also have in the atmosphere the Pacific North American, Pacific North American Index, that's a PNA, so that's atmospheric patterns basically. You also have the North Atlantic Oscillation, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. You've probably heard these terms a lot, especially here in the Southern Hemisphere. I noticed they talk a lot about SAM, the Southern Annual Mode, the MJO, the IOD. So these are all becoming very important to also predicting our synoptic scale weather. So they kind of set the background climate that then can modify what we see on the synoptic scale. And Many times, and it's not always used, but sometimes you can utilize clustering methods to identify these patterns. So the idea where you're throwing these data-driven methods to pull out kind of coherent clusters or lumping the data into similar clusters, so similar regimes from day to day. Sorry, I keep getting confused which was to press. Okay, so the data-driven method, clustering method that we are focusing on in our work is what's called the FEM-BV-VAR methodology. Now, I'll start with the VAR part. So this is actually the underlying descriptor of the cluster. So this defines the model assumed in each of the cluster states. And in that, we take a vector autoregressive model. So you have some kind of mean cluster state, and your data is also dependent on some memory of the state. So you have this term here, which you can choose whatever your time scaling is. So we're using days. You can choose a various number of days that your system will retain some memory and be affected by that. And then you also have some noise parameter there. So this is your underlying model. This is then utilized within the finite. Well, the finite element is utilized as the discretization of the cluster functional. So when you're determining how close your data is to your underlying clusters. So you will have, let's say, up to K clusters with different parameters, different VAR models representing each of them. And then on a given day, you're going to try to minimize the distance of the data to those clusters and see which one fits the best and what the parameters of that would be. So that's all that means. Don't ask me too much about the finite element method, please, because that's more my colleague Dylan Harry's area of expertise, but I can answer a few questions depending on what they are. And then additionally, we have this bounded variation term, which more or less allows us to—
Courtney?
Yes.
So is it the number of clusters is specified, is it?
It will be. So what we do is the number of clusters is a hyperparameter. So we will vary the number of clusters, but you will have to specify it in the fitting, in the fitting regime. But then, we vary. So our hyperparameters are going to be our number of clusters, our memory, and a persistence, which I'll mention in a second. And that we will take a bunch of different combinations of, and then try to find ways to determine which model fits the data the best from that.
Thanks. Yep.
But yes, then the bounded variation is exactly the persistence that I was just talking about. So this idea that you can impose a maximum of maximum number of transitions over the entire time series, which in essence imposes an average persistence, right? So the lower the number of transitions, the smaller that C, the longer your system is going to want to be sitting in one of the cluster states rather than switching back and forth quite frequently. And why do we use this particular method? Well, for one, there's no assumptions a priori on the underlying distribution of the data. And there's also no assumption of stationarity of the time series. And this is quite good in climate science because we know that the climate is non-stationary, especially over the time scales that we're looking at, or the time period that we're looking at, I should say, and with the various time scales involved. So I just want to, once again, bring your attention to this equation here, because these VAR models really define our dynamical model that comes out. So this is the form of this is quite important to why we formulate our dynamical model how we do. So the first thing that we do is just fit the optimal model for the atmospheric circulation patterns. This is what we wanted to look at first. We were interested in studying two different regions. So the first being the Atlantic region, which is where the North Atlantic oscillation happens. And we also wanted to look at the Eurasia region, which was more related to you get these extreme events related to persistent atmospheric regimes. And so we kind of wanted to have a look at that region as well. The first study that I'll go with is the Atlantic one. So what we did was we got the 500 hectopascal anomalies from the NSET reanalysis data. So that goes from 1979 until 2018, and that's daily data. And we wanted to apply the FEM-BV-VAR on those anomalies. So that's going to give us these anomalous pressure fields with some kind of circulation patterns. However, the gridded data is still quite large. so that's not really economical, really feasible to do in this fitting procedure. So we have to still reduce that data. So we take the leading 20 principal components instead. We do the PC analysis on that. In this case, I mean, 20 is well sufficient to cover the variability of the data. So yeah, we use those 20 principal components, and then we apply the FEM-BV-VAR on those 20 components each day. So our, which I'll explain in a second again, but our state space is 20, so to say. All right, so once we do that, well, okay, as Georg mentioned earlier, you know, we have a couple of choices to make. So you do have to choose when you do FEM-BV-VAR a number of clusters, memory, and an average persistence. And for the Atlantic region, we had some, due to previous clustering studies, many of them that have been done, whether it be k-means or also previous ones using FEM-BV-VAR, we already knew more or less how many clusters to look for. So we varied the clusters from 1 to 3, kind of knowing that 2 or 3 might be what we're looking at, because you know that there's at least a positive and negative phase of the NAO, and then perhaps there's another regime in that area, in that region. We did a memory of 0 to 5 days, and then we also chose an average persistence in intervals of 5 days out to 60 days to really just kind of look at how much does persistence affect the fit. And again, that's just calculated by taking the total days divided by that maximum number of transitions. And then we used a rolling origin cross validation to get the RMSE for those sets, and just identified the ones that had the lowest sets of RMSE, test set RMSE. So that's this region down here, which is blown up in this part of the figure. And at this point, I mean, we chose the one that was the minimum, but there weren't too many differences. We did the analysis on quite a few that were around this same RMSE, and the results don't change qualitatively so much. But this, the optimal model that we get through this rolling origin cross validation gives us a clustering of 3 days, a memory, sorry, a number of clusters of three, a memory of 3 days, and a persistence of 5 days. And this lines up with the literature really well. And it also, when we look at the clusters, so basically what we do is we average the fields over all of the days that were associated with a given cluster, and we put that and make that into a composite, plot it here. We see that it really comes out with 3 physical regimes that we know exist in the North Atlantic. So that NAO minus, NAO plus state, and this Atlantic ridge state as well, which has this nice high pressure anomaly in the middle of the Atlantic. So the other thing that we did to kind of verify that this is giving us a believable fit is that we looked at the observed NAO minus index. So this is something that's tracked a lot. It's kind of a it's a point-to-point basically index where they look at the difference between pressure fields in Greenland and I think the pressure fields down in the Azores, maybe it is, or an island in the Atlantic, I'm pretty sure. And so when we compare in 2 different ways, like the residency percent, so the number of days that the index was in the NAO minus state and the number of days that the clustering model wanted to put the data in the NAO minus state, the second state. We compare those and we get high correlation to that signal, sorry, to that index. So this is basically just saying we're happy with the optimal model that FEM-BV-VAR fit. And now, why were we so interested in the North Atlantic oscillation? Well, this particular teleconnection describes the regions of anomalous low and high pressure areas that have a north-south orientation over the Atlantic. And the idea being that when you have a positive phase, so the kind of background state of the atmosphere is that you have lower pressure in the northern latitudes and higher pressure towards the equator. And this is enhanced during the positive phase. So you get an enhanced zonal jet. You start getting a lot that brings stronger and more frequent storms into across the Atlantic. And it also brings mild or wet winters in Northern Europe and the Eastern US, whereas in the negative phase, you have the opposite effect. You have an anomalous high pressure region over Greenland and then low pressure south of that, which leads to blocking events, cold, dry winters in the Northern Europe and the Eastern US, and also less frequent storms. So this has some big impacts, this particular teleconnection. And we were interested in the dynamics behind this. So the previous belief, I guess to say, is that the NAO minus has enhanced predictability, right? Because of this, the NAO negative phase, because of this blocking events, and the idea that if you have a blocking event, well, then your weather is more predictable in that sense. However, recent studies have come about and said that during blocking, there's actually increased finite time instability. And also the onset and decay of the blocks have the greatest instability. So this time period where they're onsetting and decaying. So if you're thinking of the NAO negative phase as being that kind of background state for those blocking events, then one would expect that there's more instability actually during that phase. So we wanted to then analyze, see if we could analyze the stability of our very reduced climate model that came about from, or I should say just very reduced model that came about from this clustering method. So how do we get the dynamical model from the clustering method? Well, the first thing that we did is look at the affiliation sequence. So the affiliation sequence, again, is saying how well our data fits a given cluster on a given day. And so what we do there is we take the largest affiliation on a given day, and we assign that day to that particular cluster. And we do that for every day, and that gives us a switching sequence. So you know that for each day, it's going to be assigned to a given cluster. And then what we can do is we can form a piecewise linear map using the underlying VAR model, but taking away that noise of the VAR model. So just using the actual dynamical aspect of the VAR models, the mean, and then this memory term. And in reality, we're really just looking at the memory of this, because we're going to look at the tangent linear map, basically, of this. The tangent linear model is another way to put it. Linear propagator, there's a few ways that you can, a couple different terminologies depending on what field you're in, but it's basically, yeah, you're looking at you're going to be looking at the changes of, sorry, it's also a Friday for me. The propagation of errors, so small changes in X. And so you want to get this linear propagator here. So if we take this piecewise linear map that is defined a priori by that affiliation sequence, the switching, we then get a kind of time-dependent linear propagator here, where you can set this up just like you would set up a discretized delay differential equation when you're going to solve it numerically. It's very similar. I mean, it's just a delayed map, really, is what we're looking at here. And these A's are going to be dependent on your time. So they're going to change with time and based on your cluster state. Now, because we've extended it here in the delay space, we are now going from 20 principal components to 60 principal components. So our state space is actually dimension 60. Quite large in a dynamical system sense, perhaps, but very small in a climate sense. So we're still happy with this. We can still do a lot of computing on that. And then what we did here is we said, well, now that we have the linear propagator that changes in time, we can actually use an algorithm for calculating covariant Lyapunov vectors to try to get an idea of how those covariant Lyapunov vectors are behaving in time and in each state. And through that, we found that actually we can calculate what we've deemed mixed singular vectors, which on the next slide I will explain what they are. Sorry, I put it here. They're just the CLVs with a short push forward, where it basically hasn't converged to the asymptotic dynamics. And our questions were, can these MSVs and CLVs give any insight on model transitions, but also on just like the underlying, I guess, stability of the state itself and the states that come out. So, sorry, I put this slide in when I forgot to take this one out. I probably don't need to go through this as much with this audience, as I'm sure that you've most of you have seen or heard of covariant Lyapunov vectors, but basically this is related to the oscillate splitting of your phase space. So, it's tangent space decomposition, and you're looking at the local expanding and contracting directions in your phase space, and these can quantify your degree of hyperbolicity and this hierarchical decomposition of spatiotemporal chaos. Okay, so that's kind of just the qualitative description of what these covariant Lyapunov vectors can give you, but they come from the multiplicative ergodic theorem. So the idea is that at any given time, the covariant Lyapunov vectors that lie in a given subspace will grow or decay with the rate, the Lyapunov exponent, so the rate associated with that subspace. And as you can see here, you have your matrix co-cycle that we're talking about, which is going to be related to our tangent linear propagator that I showed earlier. In our case, we just have that our matrix co-cycle is just a like a composition of linear matrices, and so you can just take a composition of that in time going forward, and our base space is just time because we are only dependent on that switching sequence, and it's not phase space dependent. Okay, so we'll talk first about the finite time growth rates, because this really defined our MSVs versus CLVs, so our mixed singular vectors versus our CLVs. So what we did is when we use this algorithm for CLVs, we don't really know what the optimal window is. So you have to utilize a finite time window at the end of the day to calculate these objects, and we didn't know what is long enough, and what window is going to give us the asymptotic vectors that we need, and also what are the implications of using shorter windows. So we did a variety of windows. Here I'm showing 3 days, 10 days, 30 days, and 50 days. And we just calculated daily growth rates by looking at taking the CLV or MSV that came out of the calculation from the algorithm, applying the co-cycle or applying the tangent linear model to that CLV, and then looking at the difference in the norm. And that's going to define just our daily growth rate here. And what we know is that for a CLV, so the averages of these finite time growth rates, so these very small growth rates over many time intervals, over small time intervals, should converge to the asymptotic Lyapunov exponents. So we also calculated the asymptotic Lyapunov exponents just using the QR method, which we've shown here in these open circles. And so since we know that the CLVs, that the mean, the averages of those growth rates should correspond with the asymptotic, and particularly for the first one, we know that, absolutely for the first Lyapunov exponent, that should be no question about it. It should converge to that. So then from that, what we found is, well, then we can split these up, the windows up, based on those statistics, right? So wherever the underlying statistics, so the mean, did match up with the asymptotics roughly, we're going to call those CLVs. And then the MSVs are going to be our vectors where those means did not, and those statistics did not line up with the asymptotics. So now that we have that split, we also wanted to see what the implications of the finite time growth rates were in each, well, or I should say, we wanted to characterize the underlying, dimension, finite time dimension of the different states. So we use this finite time dimension measure, which we actually used in a previous study before in data simulation, to just characterize like relative growth between sorry, I don't know. I just confused myself with that sentence. So we use this finite time measure basically to characterize your relative growth of the MSVs and CLVs, to try to get more or less a rough number of growing modes versus decaying modes. And so this is a simple procedure where we just reorder those growth rates. So obviously the finite time growth rates are not necessarily going to match up with your different Lyapunov or oscillate subspaces. So your first one may not be your growing mode on a given day. It could be your second MSV, for instance, or your third MSV. So we reorder them by size, and then we just take the Kaplan-York dimension here with those finite time measures. And for the MSVs, we wanted to look at what the implications were for those short times. So we considered the average dimension over all days which were assigned to a state, and then the all days in the middle of a persistent state, right? So saying that the model had been in that state for 2 days before and after, and so we took the average over that. And what we found from that was that the NAO minus came out to have like the lowest finite time instability, or lowest finite time stability, I guess. So the most unstable state in that sense, whereas the NAO plus had the second lowest stability, and this Atlantic Ridge was the most stable of the three states in the finite time sense. And that supports that new interpretation that I discussed earlier regarding the predictability of blocking events. If you think about the NAO minus being this background state, where blocking can form and it's more likely to form, I guess, when the atmosphere is in this NAO minus state. So you have an increased local instability associated with the blocking states. And then this could give an insight as to why models actually struggle to capture the onset and decay of blocking events if the actual underlying state is more unstable at that point. And this is in agreement with those studies I mentioned earlier. And then what do those, I guess another thing that we wanted to look at was what do those MSVs look like over that day in physical space. And what we found is that during the persistent events, the unstable MSVs gave an NAO-like pattern. And for the transition, so whenever there was a transition between persistent states, the MSVs that went unstable actually had more of a zonally oriented kind of pressure gradient during those transitions. So we got these kind of 4 different patterns that emerged for the transitional behavior. We could also look at alignment of the CLVs, which has been said to be an indicator of transitions and catastrophic events. And it also has been discussed that there's a loss of hyperbolicity during the transition between a zonal and block state in the North Atlantic. So do we see that increased alignment at the transitions? And in fact, as you can see from this spiking behavior in this first plot, that is precisely what we see around the transition. So the symbols here are just the state indicators. And then the colored lines here are just different alignments between the first 3 vectors. So 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 1 and 3. And we do see spikes in the alignment around the different transitions. I'm just showing some of the finite time Lyapunov exponents and dimension there as well. And then if we take that over and just look at basically all of the similar transitions, so we pull out all of the similar transitions and then look at the alignment behavior around those transitions, where we center the day of transition at 0, and then I believe, the transition occurs from day 0 to day 1. And then we look at the signal of alignment, and we see that particular alignment signals come out for the particular transitions from one state to the other. And it's, I guess, an interesting thing here is that, you know, it's not all just alignment with the leading, right? There are alignment. So you see here that there's some alignment in 2 and 3, which happens. That's more prominent, perhaps, in some of these cases than the alignment with the leading vector. Okay, and then we looked at the alignment as well over all of the push forwards. Actually, we went out to the asymptotic CLVs as well. And what we found with alignment when we looked at the different push forward windows were that the lower, I guess, or the shorter windows give these like large changes in alignment quite frequently. And so that's kind of indicating the transitions. Whereas as you go further out into the asymptotic, I guess, CLVs, a low frequency signal starts to emerge, which has a period of about 1 year, which is kind of pointing towards this idea that we have a seasonality in our data, in our preference for different states. right? And we know this actually, that in observational data and reanalysis products, there have been shown to be a seasonality in the NAO. And so we wanted to look at the seasonal behavior of the alignment just to compare. And so we see that the alignment really is higher in the summer. Alignment of like 1 and 2, for instance, is quite high in the summer. And then it falls off in the winter. And we also looked at a transition index compared to the alignment, and showed that, you know, when you vary this in time, basically it's negatively correlated to the alignment. So the lower here, the lower the alignment is, the more, oops, sorry, I don't know how to go back now. Oh. The lower the alignment, the more transitions that occur in the model. So there seems to be this opposite behavior there. Okay, so I'll just kind of push on a bit because I don't want to waste too much time on the summary, and I'd like to get onto the new study. But so our next kind of question was, do the MSV, or how do the MSVs differ from singular vectors, so these like very short time vectors that we're pulling out, and what are those implications on medium range forecasting around 10 days, if there are any? And so I guess just to give a bit of background of singular vectors and mixed singular vectors in NWP. So they were kind of first introduced in 1993, singular vectors were, to define the perturbations to the initial state for ensemble forecasting. And this was from the idea that projecting onto the fastest growing singular vectors can capture the transitions in the background flow. Now, this was first implemented in 1993, but the idea dates all the way back to Lorentz in 1965. It's just, you know, computers take time to, I guess, technology takes time to catch up to the theory. So then use the leading, so yes, and the idea was to use the leading singular vectors of the linear perturbation dynamics over the finite period that you're trying to forecast. And that should give you the directions that are responsible for the largest forecast uncertainty at the end of that time interval. However, more recently, I guess ECMWF has incorporated mixing initial and evolved singular vectors in order to capture those like large scale errors, along with the small scale fast growing ones, because what was happening is there was getting a lot of saturation of error in the first couple of days, which was proving difficult to predict 10 days down the line, actually. So by mixing initial singular vectors and the singular vectors after pushing forward for the time period you're interested in, you know, they were empirically pulling out the initial perturbations for their ensemble. And our question was, are these actually empirical versions of the MSVs that we are computing? So we looked at this through a model of the year. We looked at this in the context of this Eurasia region that I brought up before. So weather forecasting over, I guess, like Central Europe more so. Western and Central Europe, and then continental, and then over into Asia. And we did the same thing, you know, ran these fitting procedures and found the found the optimal state. And this came in this region to be 3 cluster states, again, 3 days memory and a persistence of 0 days. Actually, now it's not too surprising that these are similar to the Atlantic region, because what you'll see here is state 2. If you look at the persistent states, state 2 actually is your NAO minus signal there. So the NAO actually, so this Atlantic regime has a big influence even on this sector, even though it's not incorporated necessarily, or we're not incorporating it into that sector. But it does influence looks as though it influences the dynamics and the circulation there quite strongly. So doing the same thing that we mentioned before, we wanted to compare the SVs, MSVs, and CLVs. Now, the difference here being, okay, so if we're thinking of a tangent linear propagator from time t minus m to m, you know, you can approximate that by compositions of your tangent, I guess, tangent linear propagator for a given time, tangent linear model. And just I put a little in the blue on the side over here, just a little reminder that this looks different for continuous and discrete systems, your tangent linear model. So in our case, it's quite simple, so to say, because we just have a matrix. However, when you go to continuous, it gets a bit more complicated with your exponential matrix exponentials over here. But nevertheless, it's the same concept that brings you to this propagator, which then once you have your propagator over that time window, you can either do, so you could do a singular value decomposition here, where you get basically the columns of that, of your V from your SPD, give you the directions of your stretching rates over that interval. So you'll have like the vector 1 will have the largest stretching over that interval, vector 2 will have the second largest, and so forth. And they are all orthogonal to one another. However, in the mixed singular vectors, so you start out with some initial singular vectors, actually. So we use this algorithm, Gary's Forlin's algorithm, actually, and you start out with some initial singular vectors, and then you're pushing forward that with your tangent linear model. You're pushing forward that singular vector, and then you are orthogonalizing or enforcing some kind of like orthogonalization to the underlying subspaces as to avoid collapse onto the leading singular vector. And when M is finite and small, as we said, this is your mixed singular vectors. They give your directions of local in time, I guess, growth and decay in the tangent space. Whereas when you go to finite finite and very large, or like to infinity with M, theoretically, you get the directions of asymptotic growth and decay in the tangent space. And in both of these cases, your vectors are not necessarily orthogonal. So these are those are the kind of main differences that we're working with here. And when we look at the differences between the three, so, well, we'll first just look at, here we look at the one-day growth rates again. And this is compared to the asymptotic. And so immediately what we saw is that, well, the MSV one-day growth rates are much smaller than the SV one-day growth rates, right? The singular vectors just grow very fast. And this is known to be a problem in numerical weather prediction. Whereas the MSVs grow much slower for your different windows that you're using. And then as you increase that window, eventually that growth rate will converge. However, you notice that even when you increase that window to 10 days for the SVs, that growth is still quite high, a relatively large growth for a one-day growth, which is not really what you want when you're trying to optimize over that 10-day period in weather prediction. You really want, you're trying to find the thing that's going to grow over that 10-day period. So constantly showing positive growth, should be decaying even for long time periods. And I guess the important thing is this growth is, you could say it's unphysical in the small scale patterns, because when you actually project what those SVs and MSVs look like in physical space, well, the MSVs give these kind of like nice, coherent, big structures that one would expect in these fields. And then as you go into larger windows to optimize, over, you get these small scale blotches kind of popping up in the SVs, which maybe perhaps aren't the most influential thing in the weather over that 10-day period. So that's kind of from a weather forecasting perspective, that's maybe not optimal. So we looked at this in the context of the Russian heat wave of 2010, because this was known to be caused by an anomalous pressure, like coherent pressure structure, positive pressure structure here in over, I guess, Scandinavia, Russia. And it caused an extreme heat wave from mid-July to mid-August, so very long time period, very high temperatures. This, I'll go through the impacts, but I don't really need to tell Australians about the impacts of heat waves and such. But yeah, millions of crops lost, people, losing their lives because of it. And yeah, as I said, characterized by that strong and persistent blocking event centered over Moscow. And so here I'm just showing that how our model represents this. So this is pulling out our state affiliations in the colored stars during that 2010 summer, Northern Hemisphere summer, and also with some computed indices for a heat wave, so WMO index and a heat wave magnitude index, two different ones. And so yeah, some of the heat wave kind of maybe starts in mid-June here, but then, it dies off, but then it really kicks back up in July and takes us all the way through. And we see that our model really wants to sit in state 1 during that that whole time period, which is characterized by a large high pressure anomaly, kind of in that, more or less in that region. So what we did here is we took the SVs and MSVs at a day in the middle of the heat wave. So back here at more or less, the 15th of July. So more or less in the center-ish after the heat wave was basically established. And we chose the leading SVs and MSVs of that day. And then we propagated those forward with our linear propagator and looked at how the growth rates acted in time. And the first basically just plot up here just shows that the growth rate 1, so the growth rate of our leading singular vector and MSV. And in the MSVs, we get what we expect from the theory, and that, when you have a short push forward of like 1 day, you have quite high growth in the beginning, and then that starts to decay as you move forward. Because remember, well, I actually maybe didn't say this, but asymptotically, our model is, each of our states are stable. They're only finite time and unstable. So you actually, so it eventually converges, starts to converge down, and everything wants to converge because we're not enforcing any orthogonalization here. Everything's going to want to converge to the leading, the leading Lyapunov, the leading growth rate. And then what we see is that as we increase the window of our push forward, if we go all the way down to 100 days, we're already starting. So the black line here is just the asymptotic Lyapunov exponent. So we're already starting directly on that last asymptotic Lyapunov exponent. So we are surely at a CLV at that point. Whereas with the singular vectors, I mean, even when you go out to 100 days, which theoretically this should be stable for 100 days, you are still getting very positive growth in that first vector. So surely that's not a physical, really a physical signal that we want to be projecting onto when we're doing these climate predictions. And then this is just showing the same can be said for as you go, down into subspace 2, subspace 3, subspace 4, which sometimes never mind. But yeah, the same kind of behavior as you go down to the other subspaces. And then I guess most interesting were the spatial patterns of the propagated SVs and MSVs. So here we're showing clusters of flags. So each 4 is the behavior. So you have your initial SV and then your evolved behavior after 5 days of propagation. Here you have your initial MSV and the pattern anomaly here, whereas in small scale disturbance, which eventually converge onto something large scale, but initially so these are going to be your growing modes initially, which are these very small scale features. And it's the same for each of the subspace. MSV2 and MSV4 appear to pick up that kind of high pressure anomaly that sits over Moscow, and it's kind of showing to die out a bit through propagation in this in MSV2, but then it kind of remains in MSV4 a bit. And so I guess the idea here is that, so the MSVs are actually identifying these large scale anomalies on the initial day. And then if you use these as your initial conditions, so to say, and propagate them forward, you're actually getting some propagation of the structures. Whereas the SVs are identifying the more small scale structures. And then when you propagate them forward, they're then converging to some signal. And in something like ensemble weather predicting, we might want to be projecting first onto all of these large scale structures. If we're trying to do these longer term forecasts, we want to be projecting onto these larger scale structures that grow a little bit slower, but nevertheless are growing to try to capture how those large scale patterns are evolving in time. So that's basically what I have. Maybe I went a bit over time because I think I was only supposed to do 40 minutes. But I guess I will read the summary for this one because I think it's not as straightforward as the NAO study. But so what we were really looking at was how do MSVs differ from singular vectors and what's their relationship to medium range weather forecasting. So basically for short windows, in our stationary states that we looked at, for short windows, the singular vectors and mixed singular vectors do have similar spatial patterns. However, the singular vectors have faster growth. And then for longer windows, which corresponded with medium range weather forecasting, the MSVs were projecting onto large scale anomalies consistent with your slowest growing or least decaying modes. And your SVs were projecting onto small, maybe unphysical anomalies with very fast growth. And this was also seen in some of the studies that ECMWF did of the tropics, which led to their mixing of the vectors initially. And then in our Russian heat wave case study, we basically just showed that the SVs have growth throughout the first 5 days of propagation, regardless of how large you make your optimization window. And they're projecting onto these small scale disturbances that eventually do evolve into a large scale structure after propagation. But the MSVs identify initially those large scale high pressure anomaly, the one associated to the Russian heat wave and its propagation. So I think that's all for now. I have heaps of references there, and I guess I'll end with that.